use CSS because CSS is going to help us style those elements on a web page so they look a bit better. So now it's time to get acquainted with that and introduce it to the party. So remember, HTML is for structuring content on a web page, and CSS is for making that content look more presentable, the layout and the design and that kind of thing. And to do that, we use style sheets. Now, a style sheet is essentially a full list of different CSS rules or rule sets that are used to stylize our HTML documents. Now, they look something like this. So this is a single rule or rule set. This is a single rule set, and typically we might have 10, 20, 30, 40, or even more of these that make up a whole style sheet. Now, speaking of rules, I'd like to first of all run through the basic terminology of CSS syntax, just so you're aware of it and you know what I mean when I say something. So, first of all, we have these things right here, which are selectors. Now, selectors are the things that we actually want to target on a web page. So, for example, if I wanted to style div tags, I'd use this selector. If I wanted to target li tags, I'd use this selector. Now, there's loads of different types of selectors. They're not just tags. We can use things like classes and attributes to target things as well. And we're going to talk about all these different types of selectors as we go through the course. But I just want you to know that that's the name of these things right here, the selectors, the things that target the elements that we want to style. Then we have these curly braces, which kind of look like a code block. And inside there, we have what's known as the declarations. And the declarations is just a list of key value pairs or property and value pairs. So we have a property name, which could be the color, and that's set to red. That would make the text of anything inside this div red. Then we have a margin property, which is set to 20 pixels, giving it a margin around the whole element of 20 pixels. And then at the end of each declaration right here, we have a semicolon. So that's just a bit of syntax that we use to say, look, this is the end of this particular declaration. If we skip those, then the CSS won't work. So we have to add those in. So this all makes up a single rule right here. Same down here, we have our selector, then curly braces, and inside we have our declarations, only one in this case, and that is font weight, and we're setting it to bold. Now, inside each selector, or each rule rather, we can have as many different declarations as we want to stylize it however we want to, and we're going to see all of those as we go forward. So I just wanted to throw this bit of terminology out there so that when I talk about them in the future, you know exactly what I'm going on about. So the 3 or 4 takeaway points are really that we have a style sheet, which is a list of CSS rules. This is what a single rule or rule set looks like, this whole thing. And a rule set is made up of a selector, the curly braces, and the declarations right here. So there's a couple of different ways we can add CSS to our HTML. One way is to add it directly into the HTML page inside some style tags, and we'll see that way. And another better way is to use external style sheets where we have a separate file just for all of the CSS rules. And that is the way we're going to be focusing on. We will see both ways in action, but for the most part, we're going to use an external separate file for our style sheets. Okay then, so first of all, as you can see, I've created 2 HTML files right here. I've got an index.html and an about.html. Now inside each one, there's a very basic HTML template, nothing new, we've seen all of this before. We have a title inside the head, and inside the body, we have an h1, a p tag right here, then we have a div, then we have an h2, then a p tag, and then finally we have a ul with some li's inside it. So very simple, nothing complex so far. And I've created this content so we don't have to keep repeating ourselves writing tags out, and we can just focus for now on CSS. So we have the index page right here, but we also have another page, about.html, and in there we have an h1 and just a p tag. So then what I'd like to do is show you a couple of different ways we can add CSS to a page. So the first way we can do it is by adding a style tag up here in the head or anywhere else in the document. I tend to do it up here in the head. So we'd say style, because we're going to do a style sheet right now. And inside these tags, that's where we create these different rules. So for example, I could use a selector h1, then we do opening and closing curly braces, and then inside that is where we can write our different declarations. So for example, if I wanted to color this orange, then I would use the color property and set it to orange. Okay. Now, if I wanted to do another rule after that, I can just go to the next line and I'll say P, as the selector to target the paragraph tags, and that's going to grab all the paragraph tags and style them the same way. And then I can say the color for that one is going to be slate gray. Okay, so these are just different keywords that we can use inside, CSS. Let me just undo that. I don't want to complicate anything. So these are keywords that we can use inside CSS. They come bundled into the language, if you like, so that if we want to use those colors, we can do easily by just using these keywords. So now, hopefully, the H1s should be orange and both of the P tags should be slate gray. So if I save this now and preview over here, then it looks something like this. The H1 is orange and these are slate grey. And that's how simple CSS is. It's just a series of different rules like this where we use selectors and declarations. So this way of adding styles to a page, that's absolutely fine. But what if I wanted to add the same styles to the About page? Well, then I guess I could just grab these, or rather grab the whole thing, including the style tags, copy them, and I could paste them over here inside the head of this page as well, because they have to be included on every page that we want to use those styles in. So if I save it now and then go to /about over here instead of index.html, so about.html, and go to that page, then we can see the styles on this page as well. So that's good. However, if we have 5 or 6 pages, then we want all these styles on each page. We'd have to go through each individual page and add those styles in. And then if we ever want to change those styles, that's 6 different places that we have to go in and change it. So it's not always the best idea to add styles in the HTML file itself. What I prefer to do is instead create an external style sheet and then put all of the different CSS rules inside the style sheet, then just link to that from each page that uses them. So then if we want to update them in the future, all we have to do is update them in one place and it's going to update in all the pages that link to that external file. And that's much easier. So I'm going to delete this over here and I'm going to go over here and delete this as well. And instead I'm going to create now a new file over here called styles.css. So you can call your CSS file whatever you want. Typically, a lot of people call them styles.css or styles-something.css. It must have this .css extension, but what you call it is up to you. So the same rules apply in here. We just write out our CSS. So I could now say, again, H1, and then say color is going to be orange. And then down here, we'll do a P tag, and we'll say the color is going to be slate gray. Now save it. Now if I save both of these files now, at the minute we're not going to see the CSS take effect in any of those pages, and that's because we've not linked to that CSS file from those pages. So what we need to do is link inside the head of each of the pages that wants to use those rules to that style sheet. So the way we do that is by using a link tag. So type out link, press tab, and we see we have this rel attribute, stands for relation, and we're saying this is a style sheet. That's how it's related to this document. And the href, we've seen this attribute before. This expects a path to the resource that we want to use. So we want to use this thing right here, styles.css. It's going to be a relative path to that. So if it was in a CSS folder, for example, we'd say CSS/styles, but it's not. It's in the same directory. So we can say styles.css. And now we're linked up to that style sheet from this file. So if I save it and come over here, we can see now the CSS is taking effect. Awesome. So I need to add this now to about.html and come over here, add it to the head, and then save this. And then if we go to about.html again and refresh, then we can see the CSS takes effect here as well. So now if we want to update the CSS, all we need to do is update it in one place. And because we're linked to it in both of these different pages, it's going to take effect in both of those pages. So we don't have to update it twice now in each page, just once in this external style sheet. And that's why I prefer, and many developers prefer, to use external style sheets. So then, now we know the basics of CSS. We know what a selector is, kind of. It's used to select something. We know we have these curly braces, and then we have these different declarations inside. Let's now talk about some of the basic different declarations or property names that we can use. So we've seen color, that colorizes the text. but we can also use other things. So I'm now going to use one called background hyphen color. And I'm going to set this to a color as well. That is going to be slate gray. So I'll grab that right there and save it. And if we check this out, now we can see the background of this thing is slate gray. Now, just before I go on, there are absolutely tons of different properties in CSS. We've seen two so far. We've seen color and background color, but there's hundreds. Now, no one on earth is expected to remember all of these different CSS properties. I forget them quite a lot. The more you use certain CSS properties, the more you're going to remember them. But some of them you don't use all of the time and you forget them. That's natural. So all you need to do is just Google it. Okay, you're not expected to remember all of these things. Just kind of understand them. So the next thing I'm going to show you is one called font hyphen size. And this is going to be set equal to 20 pixels. So in CSS, we can work with different units of measurements. This here is px, which means pixels. So that basically means that the font size is going to be 20 pixels. But you can also use other things like ems, rems, or something else. And I'm not going to dive into those just yet. We might talk about them briefly later on, but I don't want to confuse things just yet. I just want to stick to pixels, which is probably the simplest to grasp. So if I save that and come over here, we can see that this is now a bit smaller. Before it was larger, now we've set it to 20 pixels and it's a bit smaller. If we set it to something like 100 pixels, it's going to be much larger, huge in fact. So we have that flexibility. We can choose what the size of the font is going to be. Okay, let's do some more. I'm going to say text hyphen decoration is going to be line hyphen through. So this here is going to determine the text decoration. Now there's a few different values we can use for each property. For example, we could use different colors for the color property or background color property. We could use different values for the font size. And likewise, we could use different values, even though these are keywords, for things like text decoration. This is one of those values. If I save it, you're going to see now that it has this line through the H1. So that's good if you're doing some kind of list, if you like, and certain ones have to be crossed off. You could use this style on that. Another value would be underline, like so. And typically you see a lot of links with underline styles. And we can also set this to none to take away any of the text decoration. For example, anchor tags are automatically given an underline property. If we want to take that away, we could set the text decoration to none. I'm going to set it as underline for now, just to keep that there. And the next thing I'm going to do is set the font family. So the font family is things like Arial or Verdana. So let me set the font family now of this H1 by saying font family, and I'm going to set it equal to Arial. So save that, and you're going to notice now we have an Arial font family right here. This is Times New Roman by default. Now, it's important when you're using fonts and font families on the web that you use a web-safe font. And that basically means that everyone is going to be able to see that font. So you can read more about web-safe fonts over here on W3 Schools. I'll leave this link down below, and that explains this a little more in detail, and it shows you which fonts are web-safe. Because if you were to use some kind of exotic font that you have installed on your computer, you can't guarantee that other people are going to have that font installed on their computer, so it won't show correctly. By using a web-safe font, we can guarantee that what you see is what that user is going to see. So that's important. But anyway, the font family property right there is how we set the family of font that we use. Okay, so one more style for the H1. I'm going to say text hyphen align, like so, and I'm going to set this to center. This can also be set to left and right. So let me preview this first of all. You see this goes in the center now, but if I set this to be right, it's going to go over there to the right. And if I set this to be left, then it should go all the way over to the left as well, like so. We'll keep it at center for now. I think it looks good in the middle. Okay, so now we'll move on to the next selector, this thing right here, the next rule, and that's for p tags. So already we have this color, but let's also now say text hyphen align. Again, we're using that property, and we'll set it to right this time. So if I save it, we can see now all of this paragraph tag is over on the right. And in fact, if we just go to the home page, because we're on about at the minute, then we're going to see for both paragraph tags, it does this. So when we use a selector like this, it selects all the elements that match that selector, in this case, all paragraph tags. Okay, so next we'll go on and say line hyphen height. And what this does is set the vertical spacing between different lines in text. So what I'm going to do now is set this equal to about 30 pixels, which is quite a lot, but I want to demonstrate this. And now we can see the space between these lines is more spread out. It's 30 pixels between each line. So that's nice, we can control that. We can also control the letter spacing, which is the space between each individual letter. Now, I don't use this often unless I just add maybe 1 pixel or something like that, just to make it seem less squashed if I'm using a narrow font. But we can control it. I'll set it to 3 pixels. That is going to have an effect. You can see already it's looking very different. So you can imagine if we set this to something like 30 pixels, this is just going to look weird and crazy. Yep, okay, that just looks like a word search. So let's not do that. Let's set it back to 3 pixels, which is still a bit over the top. But anyway, I wanted to show you the property. Now, we can also do something really cool with text, and that is split it up into columns. So right now, it's in one kind of big, wide column. But you know, like in newspapers or broadsheets, you see that text is split up into 3 or 4 narrow columns. You can do the same thing in CSS. So I could say something like column hyphen count, and that is me saying how many columns I want this to be split into. And I could say 3, for example, save that, and automatically it's going to create these 3 columns for us, which is quite nice. So for a lot of designs, maybe if you're trying to mimic some kind of newspaper design, then you could do something like this. That's nice. And we can also even say column hyphen gap and set this to some pixel amount, like 60 pixels, and that is going to make this gap even bigger. So let me save it and preview, and we can see now this gap is bigger, so we can control the column gap width and also how many columns. For example, I could set this back to 2, and it would go to 2 columns like that. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, to do something else, let's move on now to a different element. We'll say this UL right here. So I'm going to say UL, and inside this I'm going to say border hyphen width. Now what this does is set us a border width on this element. So I'm going to say 4 pixels, right? So that's a border all the way around the element of 4 pixels. Now if I save this, what do you think will happen? Well, if we take a look, we can see nothing actually happens. We don't see that border right there. And that's because borders are made up of different parts, and we need at least 2 of those parts for it to show properly. So I need to also say border hyphen style to set the style of the border, which I'll set to solid to begin with, and that means a solid line. And now we see this border of 4 pixels in width going all around this UL. Now the UL is going all the way across to the end of the page because this is a block level element, and we're going to talk more about block level elements later on. But anyway, now we have that border, let's add on some more border properties. You can also set the color of a border by saying border hyphen color, and I'm going to set it equal to crimson, like so. Save it, and now we can see it's this reddish color. Okay, let's move on. I'm now going to say, in fact, what I'll do is show you the shorthand for all this. So these are 3 different properties, right, that set the border. But what we can do, instead of writing all of these 3 properties, is we can write 1 property with all 3 values in one, so it's a bit quicker. Now, to do that, I'm going to have to either delete these or comment them out. So it's a good time to show you comments in CSS. So like we did comments in HTML, to comment out certain sections of code, or to make a comment in the code itself, we can do a similar thing in CSS. So if I want to comment out a chunk of code, I can press Control and / on Windows, and that's going to comment this out. And notice, a comment is basically made up of a / and an asterisk at the start, and then an asterisk and a / at the end, and that comments out everything in between it. So anyway, now we've commented that out, it's not going to be used by the browser, so we can do this shorthand. So I'll say border, and then what we do is we say 4 pixels, the width first, then solid, which is the style, and then the color, which is crimson. So we can add all of those 3 values into this one property, and it does all of this for us. So if I save it, it's going to look no different, exactly the same. Okay, now what if you just wanted to do the border in one of these sections, for example, the border left or the border top or just the bottom? Well, we can do that. If I just now comment out this as well, Control/, then I'm going to say below that, border hyphen bottom, and then it's going to take exactly these three values, a width, and then the style, and then the color, like so. So now if I save it, we just see the border bottom. And I could do something similar for the left. I could say border hyphen left is going to be something similar. So 4, in fact, we'll make it bigger, 8 pixels. We'll do a different border style now. So we've had solid before. Let's do dashed now, and also crimson. So if I save this and preview, we can see now we get a dashed border of 8 pixels. Now we can also do a different style. We could do something like dotted as well. So let's save that and preview. And now we can see the border bottom is dotted. So I just want to show you a few more basic styles, and for that we're going to now target these li tags. So let's create a new rule, new selector, li, and inside what we'll do is say first of all list hyphen style hyphen type. Now what is this property to do with? Well, it's to do with these things right here, the dots. Okay, so by default these things are known as disk, and that is the default value, disk. So if I type that, then nothing is actually going to change. They're still disks. But we can change these. We could change them to square, like that. And we see squares. Or if we want to remove them completely, we could say none, like this. And we don't get any of those now. Now, a lot of the time, if I'm doing some kind of navigation and I'm using li tags, I use this property to get rid of those little disks because I don't want them to show. Okay, I'm going to show you one more different property, and that is text-shadow. Now, text-shadow takes in 3 values. First of all, we need to set an offset to the right of the shadow from the actual text. So I'm going to set that to be 2 pixels. Then in the vertical direction, so 2 pixels down again. And then finally, the color of the shadow, which I'm going to set to be light gray. There. So if I save this and preview, we can see this little shadow now all around. If I zoom in, these things right here, which is quite nice. It gives it a little bit of depth. Okay, it looks a bit messy, but we'll refine this kind of thing later on. So far we've seen a few basic styles. And like I said, you're not expected to remember all of these. Just know what they're doing. And as you use more and more of them as you go on, they're just going to become ingrained into your mind. Now, when we've been using colors so far, we've been using these keywords right here. And there's quite a lot of different keywords in CSS that we can use, but they're still quite limited. What if we want to use a color which isn't covered by a keyword, a very specific color? Well, for that, we can use something else called hex codes. Okay then, so far we've seen how to colorize our different HTML elements, the background color and the text color, using all of these different keywords like red or white or slate grey or something like that. And there's many different color keywords that we can use in CSS. This is just a few, but there's probably over 100 in total. Now, sometimes that's great, but sometimes we want to be more specific with the color that we use. And for this, instead of using one of these keywords, we could use what's known as a hex code instead. Now, they look something like this. They start with a hash, and then it's followed by 6 digits. Now they could be numbers from 0 to 9 or letters A to F. And together, these combinations of numbers and letters, they result in a particular color. Now the hex code is made up of 3 different channels. We have a red channel, which is the first 2 numbers. We have a green channel, the middle 2, and a blue channel as well. Now when we combine the different digits from each channel, that results in an overall color. Now for each channel, 0s represent the darkest shade and F represents the brightest or most vivid shade. For example, if we had all 0s, that would be black. And if we had all Fs, that would be the lightest color, and that would be white. Now, if we have something like 4 and then 4 zeros, that would be a deep red maroon color because the 4 is in the red channel and we have zeros elsewhere. So we don't get any other color, just a bit of red, and it would be dark. But if we had EE and the rest zeros, then we'd get a bright, more vivid red like this. Now, you would never be expected to work out a color from scratch and create the hex for it. That's just madness. But you can use tools like Photoshop or online color pickers like Adobe Color, or even VS Code itself to help you find the hex codes that you want. Okay then, so I'm back in VS Code, and what I'm going to do is actually just comment out this text shadow that we did before. So Control/, and then down here I'm going to do exactly the same, text hyphen shadow, and it's going to be 2 pixels horizontal, 2 pixels vertical, and now I'm going to use a hex code. So remember, they start in a hash, and then it's a series of digits or numbers, 6 in total. Now I'm going to use E9, 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 and I've not plucked that from thin air. I used a color picker to get this color, but if I save it now, this is a very, very, very light gray. So it looks a bit more natural. If we zoom in here, you can just about see that shadow, and that looks a bit better. Now, I said that VS Code comes with a color picker to help you get these hex codes. So what you could do is just hover over one of these colors, and then this little box shows up. So if we go to the box, you can click this at the top because this is currently set to RGB until you see a hex code. And then what you can do is just move this around like this. You can also move this thing up and down to get different colors. And when you're happy with the color, it's going to update it over here for you. So now we have this green color. So that's a nice little addition to VS Code. It really helps us to grab the colors that we want. So if I save this now, we should see this green border over in the browser, which we do. So then, HTML files are made up of loads of different tags or elements. And some of those elements are known as inline elements, and some are known as block level elements. Now the difference between these two types is how they're displayed in a browser and how much room they take up on the page. So inline elements also have some CSS limitations with certain properties, and we'll see that as well later on. But essentially, inline elements line up next to each other in the browser, and they don't take up any more room than their content needs. So a few examples of inline elements include an image tag, an anchor tag, span, strong, EM, and a few more. Now, if you were to place these one after another inside an HTML file, then they'll sit next to each other on the page until they run out of room, a bit like this. Now, block level elements, on the other hand, they take up the whole width of the page, and they do not sit side by side. They always start on a new line. So some examples of block level elements include a div, a block quote, paragraph tag, a form, H1, H2, H3, etc., and many more. A lot of HTML5 semantic tags, which we're going to look at later in the course as well, are also block level elements. So if we were to write a series of block level elements inside an HTML file and output it to a browser, it would look something like this: a p tag and a div tag. So each one takes up the full width of the page, and also each one starts on a new line. Now, the logic behind having these two different types of elements, inline and block level, makes sense. Imagine that we've got a paragraph tag right here, P and closing P. This is a block level element, and it's going to take up the whole page. So the text is going to go all the way across and then go to a new line all the way across, etc. Now inside that we have an anchor tag. So this thing right here would be a link. Now this is an inline element, so it wouldn't start on a new line, and it would only take up the space needed for this content. And that makes sense because we don't want this tag to start on a new line. That would just look weird. But if we were to add another paragraph down here, you would want that to start on a new line because that is a block level element. It's a new section of content and it goes to the next line. That makes perfect sense. So you typically see inline elements like this nested inside block level elements, but you shouldn't nest block level elements inside inline ones. So you wouldn't put a paragraph tag inside an anchor tag, for example. But you can nest block level elements inside another block level element as well. So let's see some of these inline and block level elements in action in the code. So then back inside our index file over here, what I'm going to do is actually delete all of this content because I want to just work with some different content now, and I'm just going to paste this little bit of HTML inside it. So very simple. We have an H2 with a title inline elements. Ironically, this is not an inline element itself, an H2, but these ones below it are. We have a span tag, we have an EM tag, an anchor tag, and then another span tag. So if I was to save this now and preview, it would look something like this. Now back over in the CSS, I'm going to also delete all of this. We don't need this anymore. And what I'm going to do is start working with these different inline and also block level elements. So at the minute, these are all just inline elements. And if we take a look at those in the browser, we can see that because they all sit next to each other on the page. They don't go to a new line, and they only take up the room that they actually need for that content. So if we inspect these, and hover over them, we can see exactly how much room each one is taking up. They sit next to each other. Now, if I was to instead do a load of block level elements, which I'm also just going to grab and paste in below these. So now we have an h2, which itself is a block level element. And then we have a div, another div, an h3, paragraph tag, ul, and then two li's. Now all of these are block level elements. So remember, we said that these all take up the full width and each one starts on a new line. So if I save that, then come over here, we can see that the first div tag, then another div tag, then the h3, then a paragraph, then two li tags at the bottom. These are all starting on a new line, and that is what block level elements do. And if I hover over these, you can see that blue box goes the full width of the page, and that is the element itself taking up the full width. Even though the content is only this small or this small, the elements themselves take up the full width. And by the way, the orange that you see there, that is known as margin. We'll take a look at that shortly. But anyway, all of these things now take up the full width. And if we just select one of these and bring this up from the bottom, and we'll talk more about this later on, what I'm going to do is show you this thing right here. This looks like a CSS rule. We've not done it ourselves. This is a user agent style sheet, meaning that the browser has automatically applied this CSS rule for us. This is a default browser style. So it's displaying a div as block, but it also displays the h3 as block and the paragraph as block. So the browser is making these block level elements. If we go to something up here like a span, then we don't see anything because the default value is just to display inline. So these inline and block level elements are actually controlled via this display property, which we just saw right here, display block. It's a CSS property. So if we wanted to make an inline element a block level element, we could do that. We could just go to our CSS, and I'm going to grab a span tag, and inside I'm going to say display as block. And now if I save this and go back to the browser, then we're going to see that this span tag now takes up the whole width of the page. If I hover over that span, it takes up the whole width, and this span down here now takes up the whole width. These are still inline, but these, the spans, are now block level elements because of this CSS property that we've set. Now we can do the same thing for block level elements. We can set the style to be inline, so I could come down here and say div and then display as inline instead. Save that, and now they become inline elements. So now these two divs right here, they sit next to each other, and if we hover over those, we can see they only take up the room that the content needs. So these two types of display also have an effect on what CSS properties we can apply to these different elements, particularly when it comes to margin. So imagine we have some kind of block level element like this div tag right here with this 5 pixel border all the way around. Now in CSS there's a property called margin which allows us to specify the margin or space around the outside of the element border, so it looks something like this. And there's also a property called padding which allows us to control the internal space within an element that looks something like this. Now when we add margin and padding to a block level element all the way around, this all works as expected, there's no problems. But now imagine we have an inline element like a span tag. If we try to add margin and padding all the way around to that, the margin won't be added to the top and the bottom. It will be added to the left and right perfectly, but not the top and bottom. The padding, however, is fine. So it's important to remember that block level elements can have margin all the way around the element, but inline elements can only have margin to the left and the right of the element. The padding, however, can be added all the way around in both cases. Alright then, so now let's have a little play around with these two different properties, padding and margin, on inline elements and block level elements. We'll start with the div over here because we know that everything should work fine on a block level element. The first thing I'll do is give this a border so we can see the border of this element, 2 pixels, solid and crimson. And then I'll give this a margin, that's the property name, of 20 pixels. And this means apply a margin 20 pixels all the way around. We could also do something like margin left, or margin top, or bottom, or right. But if you just say margin on its own, that applies it all the way around. We'll do the same thing for padding, and say 20 pixels for that. So let's save this, and preview over here. And now we can see these div tags, they both have that margin all the way around, the orange. they have the padding, which is the green, and the blue is the element itself. So that's all working as expected. And over this div, we see exactly the same. Now let's try the same thing with an inline element, for example, the span tags. So we have at the minute a span tag right here and also right here. So let's try now applying some padding and margin to them. So if I come up here and say, okay, I want this to have a margin of 20 pixels all the way around, let's see what this does. I'm going to save that and come over here and notice now that we get this span tag right here, which has a margin to the left and right, but it doesn't have the margin at the top and bottom. And that's, remember, because this is an inline element and they cannot have a margin top and bottom. So it ignores that and just gives it to the left and right. And the same goes for this span tag over here. So now let me try apply padding to this. So padding is going to be 20 pixels as well, all the way around. And check this out. Okay, so if we make this a little bigger, then this span tag has padding all the way around. That works absolutely fine. And so does this one. But watch this. If I go smaller like this, then we can see that this span tag right here kind of sits on top of the other one. And that's because the padding kind of collapses in a vertical manner on top of these two things. Now, this only happens with inline elements, so you need to watch out for that. The padding kind of goes on top of each other. So even the padding in the vertical direction doesn't always behave as you would think it would inside inline elements. Now there is also one other thing I'd like to show you, and that is margin collapse when it comes to block level elements. So if we look at this div right here, the top one, we see it has a margin bottom of 20 pixels. But I also said give the bottom one here a margin top of 20 pixels. Now really, they should be 40 pixels apart because we have 20 on the bottom and 20 on the top of this one. But in actual fact, they're only 20 pixels apart. So it's not actually adding up the margin of the bottom of this and the top of this. Instead, it just squashes them together and applies the 20 pixel margin, and that is margin collapse. If this had a margin bottom of 60 and this of 20, then the margin between them would just be 60, which is the largest of the two. So that is margin and padding in a nutshell. We will be using both of these properties quite a lot later, especially when we come to make that website near the end. Actually, there is one more thing I'm going to show you, and that is how to get the best of both worlds when it comes to block level elements and inline elements, and that is a third display type called inline block. And what that does is essentially mix the two different types. So for example, if I was to set the span to display as inline block, then what it would do is get the best of both worlds. It would still sit next to other elements in the page like inline elements do. They won't go to a new line and take up the full width, but it will enable us to treat it like a block level element in terms of margin and padding. So we can add margin top, we can add margin bottom, and padding bottom and top are also going to work better as well. So if I save this and preview, then come over here, we can see now these span tags, they are looking a bit better. So I can hover over this and I can see the margin and the padding all the way around, and the same down here as well. So this works a bit better. So I'll often use inline block if I want elements to sit next to each other in the page like this, but also if I want them to have top and bottom margin and padding to work correctly as well. Okay then, so we're nearly there, but there's one more thing I want to talk about in this video before you all go and have a lie down and rest your minds, because you probably need it, and that is default browser styles. So what are they? Well, when we create HTML and we preview that in a browser, then the browser styles certain elements in a particular way without us having to do anything to them. For example, all of the headings are quite big and they're bold, and anchor tags, they all are underlined and they're either blue or purple dependent on whether we've visited that website or not. And also paragraph tags, they have margin applied to them, etc. So these are all known as default browser styles. They're just styles applied to these different elements, so basically we can tell what they are on a page, and they're kind of there for accessibility. If someone doesn't have CSS or we don't add any CSS, we can still tell what these different things are based on these default browser styles. So we can actually see these default styles inside the console over here, or rather inside the developer tools. So if I go, for example, to a H2, this right here, this says user agent style sheet, and a user agent is basically the browser. It's the browser style sheet that's applying these default styles over here. So we can of course override these default styles with our own rules. So if I wanted to take this display property of an H2 and set it to inline, I could do that if I wanted to, and it would override this rule. So I just wanted to make you aware of some of these default browser styles before we go on into the next section, because then we're going to start talking about inheritance, the cascade, selectors, etc. And this is a little important to understand the rest of the course as well. Okay then my friends, so we have covered quite a lot in this video, so much so that I would not be surprised if I fried your brain. But do not worry if you don't remember everything we've looked at so far. As I keep saying, this is not a memory test. You're not meant to remember everything, but just understand what we're doing as we're going forward. And the more we use the different selectors, the more we use the different HTML tags, the more it's going to sink into your brain and become second nature. I promise you that. So in this video, we've learned what CSS is and how to add it to a web page. We've done that either in the head, in style tags, or in an external style sheet, and then we've linked to that from the HTML page. We've also seen some basic selectors to choose different elements on the page, like a p tag, or a div, or an li, or an a tag, and we've styled those with different declarations or properties to make them different colors, different font sizes, or something else. We've also had a look at what hex codes are, and we've seen how we can use VS Code's color picker to choose hex codes for us, which is really nice. And we've had a little discussion about the difference between inline and block level elements, and also the combined power of both of those in inline block, which is one of my personal favorites. We've had a little look at the two properties margin and padding, and we've also seen how those behave with inline and block level elements and the differences between those two. And then finally, we've talked very, very briefly about default browser styles. So, phew, a lot, like I say. But now we know the basics of CSS, I want to take this one step further. We're going to take a look at some different selectors that are a bit more complicated than the ones we've seen so far. So far, we've just been selecting individual elements like P or div or li. Next, I want to introduce something called classes into the fold and other things as well. So we'll take a look at that